Hello and welcome back to JLXP, post week 6, episode 67. Emily Rand back at it again. Thank you once again for joining me. And we had another interesting week of LCS. There was a moment in my head where I was thinking of titling the episode like Pretenders and Contenders because we had, we're going to start actually. I'll give a quick overview of what to expect from the episode. We'll start talking about CLG because they showed up on their 2-0 week that we'd kind of given them the test for. But then I think we also got some really good data on the traditional top 4, which is EG, 100 Thieves, C9, TL. And we're going to kind of revisit the top 4 and what could be wrong with the teams, what we think is working from the teams, and what we may or may not expect to change going down for the rest of the split and then kind of move into playoffs based on, what we've seen at this week 6 juncture with 5 games remaining. But yeah, CLG and what they've shown us. 2-0 this week. How are you feeling about that squad?
I love CLG. I was really, because we've talked about the difficulty of having longer narratives throughout a season in best of ones, just because it's so hard. Like anyone, even though obviously there's a significant jump actually from 7 through 10 to top 6, and then again from 3 to 2.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Just for people that might not look at the standings that frequently, we have very clearly at the top EG, 100 Thieves, 11-2, 10-3, a 2-win gap between the playoff bye and then the C9 CLG TL clump at 8-5. FlyQuest in 6th at 7-6, but then 7th, 8th is 4-9, a 3-win gap. So it's almost unthinkable that anyone from that bottom 4 moves into that top 6. Then you kind of have CLG, FlyQuest meandering in that 5-6, and then you kind of have that top 4, which is also delineated by the 2. But continue your point on CLG.
Yeah, and you still are gonna weight that, right? So whenever Dig is taking on a game, unfortunately, especially with the recent roster changes, you take that into consideration. You're they're going to be a worse team. We have lower expectations going into this matchup.
Yep.
But with that being said, in single games, they're so much more heavily draft dependent. Anything can happen in the moment, and so it is hard to sometimes think about this team can drop a game. And CLG is one of those teams that previously had been kind of volatile whenever they were trending up, right? They would make a mistake and lose a game that they were quote unquote supposed to win if they were a top team. So this is a really big week for CLG, and I'm so happy that they showed up. They beat the 2 teams that they were quote unquote supposed to beat if they are contending for that top 5 spot. It maybe even sneaking into top 4 against one of the other presumed teams that's going to be there. And that's just so awesome to see, honestly, to see them not slip up in a week where, if you slip up, it wouldn't be unexpected per se, but it's just so much nicer for them. It's so much nicer, selfishly, narratively for us that we can talk about them. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, because there's so much when you're trying to build a story in a best of one, a team slips up against a bad team, and then it seems like you're telling a fake story just because they didn't pass that test. And I liked the point the analyst desk brought up before the CLG game today against Dignitas. It might have been a stat Mark requested, but it was contracts deaths from spring to summer.
Yep.
Through 5 weeks in spring, he had over 5 deaths a game, which was very close to an LCS record, if not an LCS record, and he's cut it in half. Mm-hmm. Actually in half, which is it's rare that you see that because there's so many, just to kind of go back further, esports is so reactionary. I think so many other orgs just bench contracts to the Shadow Realm after he dies that much in spring and say he's the reason that we've lost. But they identified a different reason. They wanted a stronger laner in top lane to create more avenues to play through on the map and continue to play with Palafox pushing and roaming. And they found so much more success. Contracts obviously improved, but I just actually don't think he gets another chance if he's on, 5 or 6 different other teams.
And it's so cool because you can now track, part of Mark's stat was to be look, some of these stats, they're not going to be amazing, right? But if you look across almost every single player outside of a few outliers. Like I pointed out that the Jenkins stats are a bit skewed only because, and this is no slight to Jenkins, who I think got a lot of criticism that he actually did not deserve. But he had really, really inflated laning stats just because of having to go up against Smite top a bunch of times in the beginning of spring. The incremental improvement that you can track statistically across all roles, and then on top of that, the contract's death stat is really cool. I pointed out a play that like I think CLG would have flubbed or overforced or not considered more avenues for with Palafox roaming to sides. And I think it's that kind of incremental improvement where you can track like, oh, they're a lot more aware of like what they're going to give up in the wave state here, right? And how they can fix that. And I feel like that doesn't happen if they don't decide to stick with most of this lineup, right? If you don't give this mid-jungle duo in particular a chance to improve and grow together.
Yeah, I do want to give CLG their props, especially when they succeed. And we gave FlyQuest their props last week when they beat Dignitas Golden Guardians as well. And we know the top 4 teams are also the 4 biggest spenders. So the expectation is that they are going to be top 4. FlyQuest and CLG are kind of dancing with those teams a little bit. They've taken some games off of them. The records are extremely close to at least the Team Liquids and the C9s. And they have made a very large gap between themselves and the rest of the soup that is way down in the 4-win and 3-win and 2-win territory. So it's impressive, but then also it's like it's hype with a reasonable expectation. Like I didn't expect FlyQuest to come into this week when they play against C9 and EG and go 2-0. I thought there was a decent chance they win a game. But then like that immediately pulls my eyes to the CLG C9 game at the very start of week 7. Like, is this just the pattern we get into where it's like, yes, they did what they're supposed to do, but can they do more? And kind of like how disappointed will you be in them if they fall short, say next week against C9?
Yeah, and that's going to be super interesting, especially since like even in today's Dig win, I think you could also see some of CLG's like tendencies that do come back to bite them in a lot of games with some really overly aggressive plays and map movements. So we'll see if that also kind of comes out next week, because that game is going to be really, really interesting.
Yeah, I give them probably a 35% chance, which is kind of the same chance I give FlyQuest. I don't necessarily think less of FlyQuest. I didn't think they were a top 4 team, but there's still that test. Like they get to they buy themselves that believability that they can do it with how they've performed against the rest of the LCS. Do you have anything more to add about CLG?
They play FlyQuest on Sunday next week, so that should also be interesting.
Yeah, that's the 5th-6th match. The difference between 5 and 6 is actually very small when you consider the playoffs, because 6 plays 3 and 4 plays 5. Okay. CLG and FlyQuest, but kind of the meat of the episode is going to be this top 4 discussion. Let's start with the teams that deserve it. Let's start with Evil Geniuses. They 2-0'd. This was probably one of their weaker 2-0s. They had an Elder Dragon steal against Immortals. Immortals had a tragic week. They played the 2 best teams in the league. The result is exactly what you expected in terms of wins and losses, but the games themselves are actually so close. But EG squeaks a win against Immortals, and then today against why am I blanking temporarily? Today against FlyQuest, there was actually a pretty sound victory. Inspired just kind of dunked on everyone with Wukong in that game. But in terms of what is working for them best and what could possibly go wrong for them, let's just start with what they've been doing best, in your opinion.
So for me, I think obviously Inspired's just having like a monster season overall.
He's got to be the MVP favorite.
I would highly disagree with someone who doesn't have them as their MVP favorite, actually. But for looking at JoJo, actually, it's kind of a similar thing to what I was talking about with Palafox and contracts on CLG. JoJo was someone who, during a lot of his map movements, especially in the regular season, this also improved in playoffs, he would give up a lot for what he tried to do in side lanes, or what he tried to do when he was like partnering up with Inspired, and you saw some miscommunications between the two of them, even when they were trying to go for set plays that you could tell like one of them had called for. And I think going to MSI was really good for JoJo, just listening to him talk about it and listening to him put together like the things that he had been trying to practice already, because initially, all the way back in spring, the thing I was worried about the most is that he was just going to try to like pub stomp every game, right? Like, and try to be like the super hard carry. And that's actually from the initial get-go not what they decided to do. Like, it was set plays and side lanes. He was on like TF, he was on Rise. And I think you see a lot better understanding from him in terms of what they want to do mid jungle, which helps the rest of the team out so much more. Like, and their team fighting has also only improved. They were always a good team fighting team, but just their understanding of how they want to fight, to take fights, to open up space for Danny or JoJo in particular is a lot better, in my opinion, than it was in spring. And I know everyone brings up, because like it's weird how people categorize EG, because they bring up their decisiveness and their proactivity, and then they marry it in their minds with like mindless early game aggression. And I actually don't think the latter is true of EG that much. Like they can have games like that, but that's not actually how I'd categorize their play. I think they do like to go to side lanes, and then they do like to play for 5v5 team fights, especially with Danny as a, preferred hyper carry player.
Yep.
So that's where I really see a lot of improvement in like the team understanding of like 5v5s, and then the mid jungle duo I think has improved so much, because previously it was just like Inspired is a really good player, JoJo has a lot of raw talent, so it's working. Right. But I didn't consider them a super strong mid jungle duo, and now I do.
Right. And that's MSI, that's time, that's maturity for JoJo. He's still in his rookie year, which is crazy. Most players that you talk to now are saying he's the best mid in the league. So just huge growth from him. If you have to be fairly nitpicky to try and find weaknesses with an 11-2 team. So I'm kind of going to intentionally be a little nitpicky here. I wrote this in last week's 10 Thoughts, but it's about, because they are so willing to opt into fights, even if they generally have good setup, that will naturally lead to higher variance than, say, what you had from like a 2019 version of TL when they first brought in Cordaday and Jensen and started the split 14-1. Because they do play faster, which naturally means like if you do click a couple of your buttons wrong in team fights, it's going to go wrong for you. But then also the second thing would be this is a struggle that Cloud9 had in 2020 when they were too dominant. Everything works. So how do you know what actually works? And they can kind of do whatever they want. Impact can go 1-8 on Gwen. They'll win. Danny can greed a recall when Vulcan has just disappeared on a ward, which happened today, and then give a kill over to Aphelios in a Kalista Aphelios matchup, which you're not allowed to fall behind in. And it's fine because Inspired's got him, right? Because they cover for each other so well, it allows them to maybe not take as many mistakes to heart as they possibly should. And that's like the one nitpicky red flag I would have for them, that it is difficult to sustain that level of play, and it is actually hard to stay at the peak in your game when you're so dominant.
And what sometimes happens with teams that, are so much better than the field around them is that this happens. I see it happen with a lot of LPL teams too, especially since they also will opt into going for fights more often than not. And it's that once you get to playoffs and there is a patch shift, suddenly you have been getting away with a lot, and now you have to adjust your play to a different patch. And the patch coming up is actually, in my opinion, pretty large. They're calling it the pre-Worlds patch, right? Because supposedly any patches that follow are going to be minor adjustments to this. To this patch that's touching like itemization and runes and a bunch of other stuff in addition to champion fixes. Yeah. So I think that could be a kind of tripping point for a lot of teams. I'm not going to exclude EG from that list. I do, however, think that on the flip side, I would much rather have a team play more fast and loose and be making visible mistakes, because I think the practice you still get in making those mistakes is really valuable.
Yeah, I actually think there's two things that EG has done that are good, but are difficult to do because it goes against the grain of what is established and what is necessarily expected from teams. Like, one of them was originally promoting Danny and JoJo when players like Doublelift and Jensen were available. I can't put a number on it. A lot of teams in the LCS will just never do that. And the second one would be, let's just like int a couple games. Because as soon as you lose to a bottom team, it's like you're getting called in for a meeting and being asked what's wrong. It's like, well, no, this is just actually part of the process. In previous episodes of Freak, I talked about what I wanted to do at the start with 2021 TL, and so much of that was actually need to play very aggressive. You need to play high variance, because if you're going to beat teams that are better than you at Worlds, you need to be able to make huge risks. If you play low risk against a team that's better, you're just ensuring that you lose. So stuff like that, EG's been able to encapsulate that a little bit, and also encapsulate the new players, which I think it's just paying off for them in a huge way. Now, it just didn't, like, it actually took the time. It took all of Spring Split and the like upper bracket of Spring Split playoffs before it clicked. So definitely played on the margins there. But okay, EG definitely the best right now. 100 Thieves slept through the start of the split, but are only one game out of first and also beat EG. So I'd say a hardcore 100 Thieves fan would actually say, like, hey, 100 Thieves is better than EG, or at least on the same level. What is standing out to you about this team?
I was gonna say, I saw in 10 Thoughts that you got called out by the 100 Thieves
100 Talk podcast.
Or 100 Talk podcast. I thought that was really funny. I do think 100 Thieves is very difficult to talk about in that way, and I know that people are already probably sick of me making LPL references, but I see 100 Thieves as like an RNG type team, where like even in RNG's most like dominant splits, where they went on to win titles, where they went on to do really well internationally, there was always a lot of like shakiness in some of their series wins. And additionally, like previously they would like bench Uzi entirely so that he would get some rest at the beginning of the season. You see a lot of LPL teams kind of play really fast and loose at the beginning of splits because the good ones kind of know that eventually they'll stabilize, and they're really confident in their abilities, and they have people who fundamentally understand the macro game. Like Xiaohu is a major one, Ming is another major call out. I'm not saying 100 Thieves are RNG because they play differently, but I do think that this 100 Thieves team, talking to multiple players on this team, it was really interesting to hear that all of the, like, last split when they weren't doing as well, they seemed worried internally. They commented on it. They commented on how like they were so happy that someday could, be this rock for the team, and while they're figuring out their issues, blah, blah, blah. I don't get the sense from the team like that at all this summer. Like, even when they're making mistakes, they're like, we made some mistakes. Things are still going really well internally. We're doing fine. I know Huhi has come out and said, you know what? It feels, again, like the split where we won a championship. It seems to still be like a very good attitude there. Obviously, Someday is still having some like really just monstrous individual performances that have been very, very impressive. But I think in making some of their mistakes, again, this is a team that I will only worry about a lot once, like, if they get to first round of playoffs, which they're, already qualified for top 6. If they get to first round and like completely bomb their first, match and get bopped down to loser. And I'm not talking like a close best of 5 where they lose to a strong team. I'm talking like, 0-3 for some reason and just look absolutely like destroyed. And even in best of 5s, we've seen this team have really high variance between their games. Obviously the TL series from last spring, everyone remembers. So this is a team that's so difficult to talk about in the regular season. I know you've been struggling with that as well, because you want to comment on them week to week about what you see from them in game. that this is still a team of very good players who know how to win a championship, and perhaps more importantly, seem to communicate very well with each other on the Rift. And that can mean a lot, especially in best ofs.
Yeah, the term that I like for this that happens with every team, but specifically with 100 Thieves, when we're trying to talk about them, is being a prisoner of the moment. Because when Abadage is running it down in weeks 1 and 2, that's all you see. And that's kind of what you feel trapped to talk about, even if you know that he's good and that he's cared about League of Legends for 5 or 6 years, and he's going to bounce back. So it's really tricky. We're going to get to this with TL as well. They're 8-5, and I'm definitely I had more TL faith than other people. It's definitely dropping heavily. But like, is that because I'm just watching every game so closely, and is it just all going to equal out as soon as you get to the first split of the playoffs? So with 100 Thieves, I feel like I've solved how to talk about them. I just say they're not a regular season team, and it's paying off now because they're winning, but they're almost winning like before I expected them to turn it on. Like, they turned it on faster than I expected. They're undefeated in the second half. They've got the longest winning streak in the LCS at 5 games. They're 1 game back from Evil Geniuses. They may even get the number 1 seed at this clip that they're on. I guess in terms of like a red flag for the team, it would be a bit of a lack of creativity. Like, because they didn't push in the regular season, they've just kind of defaulted back to the things that they know they can win with, rather than having like high quality practice on different types of stuff, which will possibly make them a little bit easy to figure out in a best of 5. That's all I got in terms of negativity. It's hard when they're on a 5-game win streak and they're 10-3.
It's also hilarious because I know we talked about it on Analyst Desk and on broadcast in spring too, where we're like, oh man, 100 Thieves, this team isn't looking good. They're saying internally they're working through some stuff. They ended, if people remember, on a 7-game winning streak, and they only slipped up against Dignitas, their old nemesis, in their final match of the regular season.
Then they swept even Summit out of the league. Just even out of there.
Oh no. Even then they were like having a really strong end of season performance. So this is also something that's very characteristic of the team now.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Let's do C9 next, who are on a 4-game winning streak. Last week they had the least impressive 2-0. This week they had the best match of the day in terms of hype on both Saturday and Sunday. They had to play FlyQuest on Saturday, and then today they played TL. Got Jensen a little bit of sweet revenge, and then he just trash-talked them on the desk for the whole post-game segment, called them slow and boring. But like, they can definitely, in terms of being a prisoner of the moment now, like, they're definitely riding a high because they just beat 2 of the top 6 pretty soundly in back-to-back games. So how are you feeling about C9?
I'm feeling really good about C9. I said in one of my lukewarm/cold takes that I think C9 are going to ramp up a lot during playoffs and kind of make like at least top 4, top 3. Mm-hmm. But I think the big thing to me with the C9 team is talking again to the players a lot and looking at the way they've performed. They are still reliant on some individual outplays. Like, everyone on this team is so good, right? Yeah. Like, they know they have good players. And more than that, from multiple players on the team, they have good opinionated players who all have very like strong understanding of how to play the game, and additionally have to work through like their communication. And I know that was like initially not necessarily an issue, but that was definitely something that they themselves were working through as the roster was coming together. And it's something we'd cited, prior to Sven role swapping, is that like one of the things I love about Sven, coming from a journalism background previously, right, is that he was always a phenomenal interview because I could just sit there and chat with him about the game. He's just a really smart person who has very strong opinions on how the game should be played. And so I think those are C9's like strengths. I think some of their weaknesses still is that in some of these games, you will see that it sometimes comes down to an individual outplay Today it didn't come down to that, in my opinion. What it did come down to, though, was a really interesting Baron where we were trying to talk through it with Jensen, because he came out and said, like, and we were surprised. We went back and watched this, like, as the game's going on, like, so many times. Me, Raz, and Mark are just sitting there, like, rewatching this Baron. We're like, did TL know? It seems like they must have known, but then they reset and they just give it up. So did they mean to give it up? And, until, I don't know if this will be on mic check this week, but until we hear comms, we just won't know. But, Jensen himself was like, I was just like, wait, they're just backing off, like they're resetting. I don't know why. Because I think in most situations you at least like check it, try to go for a steal, only because in that situation with the composition they had, even given how strong Kalista is at taking objectives and how actually just insane Kalista Azir is at taking a Baron, I still think their team composition has trouble against the late game scaling of TL. So I thought that was a really smart call from C9, but I also was like, oh man, like, is TL just purposely giving this up? Like, what's going on, right? And that's really what got them into a strong winning position. And once they were there, and this is the thing, like, when C9 make mistakes, they do still, in my opinion, overly rely on having one of their 5 incredibly strong players having an individual outplayer, having a situation where they take advantage of it. But once they take advantage of it, the way that they see through the rest of the game is very smart. So you can see the trajectory of like how good this team could be. And that's very, very interesting to me.
The Baron, my first impression was that TL felt like it was a natural reset, and then kind of probably the second they got back in base, they're like, like it was one of those, like it was just a split second decision where they forgot that the other team was Kalista Azir. In terms of C9, I don't actually disagree with anything you said, and I'm realizing the dynamic of this segment is turning into a little bit of like Emily praises the team and then Jat pokes holes, which is fine.
Sorry.
It's actually fine. So to poke a few holes in the C9 armor, yes, they have. The point that I'll go in on a little more is that they are often relying on individuals to outplay in certain situations, and you still can't be sure that their weaknesses won't show up in the wrong way. So a few things that I think would be overlooked in a conversation of talking about how they're 8-2 since having the new roster together would be, I have a couple. One would be Fudge. So understanding of the game, I feel like Fudge is one of the highest, if not the highest, in terms of top laners. I would say he is the highest in terms of understanding and being able to articulate it. So you just really understand how much is going through his head. I think that much probably goes through like Impact and Bwipo's heads as well. But like just, especially with Impact, the language barrier makes it so it's harder to access that information. And then also I think we're overlooking some like really bad games by Fudge. So in like even today, like his laning phase was pretty poor. Yes, he got counterpicked by Olaf, but he just gets straight up solo killed in lane, goes down a large amount of CS, but then he brings it back in teamfights. Like he plays teamfights extremely well. He knows the right flank angles. He knows how to recover. He knows how to play from behind. But he's had like more than I think is recognized in terms of shaky games, which he'll still have redeeming qualities in those games. But when you're up against Impact and Someday and even Bwipo as the other competitors in playoffs, not actually looking as strong. Right now, I'll actually say Blabber and Jensen are fine. The next two that I'd talk about would be Berserker, who, this is a little bit of insight Fudge gave us. Like they've had these entire reviews dedicated to basically everyone talking at Berserker about how they want to play the macro game. There's a language barrier. He's a very young rookie player, amazing mechanics, but hard to get him on the same page. And the last one would be Sven, where he's a grinder and he has great mechanics and a good understanding of the game. But because he's so new to support, there's just going to be some ingrained things that he's not as good at ad-libbing at as he gets into a deeper series, and might have some patterns that he doesn't realize just because he's such a drill type player where he just does kind of the same things over and over. I see a lot of places where other teams could possibly attack this team. But with that being said, like I actually right now, off of their wins, put them right in that top 3. Like it's right now to me, it's like EG, 100 Thieves, Cloud9, and TL looking in. We'll do like a ranking after this if you're down, but that's my take on C9.
I would agree with that. I think the other thing with Sven that you have to watch out is that sometimes he'll have these like insanely good positioning and like mechanical plays, and then sometimes his positioning will be just slightly off, and a lot of that is just due to lack of experience in a support role.
It's a hard role swap to make, and he's making it fast. So really high expectations. Like the Huhi role swap, even like I guess the core JJ role swap back on Samsung was actually really fast as well, because he just like did it in a split and then went all the way to World Finals.
It was fast, but it was also like at that time they had I won't spend too much time on this, but there's like a really specific set of circumstances, which is basically the changes to turrets happened with that Samsung team when they were qualifying through the LCK qualifier, and they had another support, Wraith, who was really, really good. It's so funny that Core JJ is known for roaming now, because back then he was the better laning support than Wraith, but Wraith was a better support for Ambition, who was still kind of learning what his jungle style was going to be. And so when he first made that role swap, he was actually exponentially helped by the fact that he had a really like the strong understanding he had about the way that a 2v2 matchup should go was aided by his AD carry experience, obviously. And so it allowed him to get into that position and integrate himself really quickly in a meta that really favored 2v2s.
Yeah.
And I would say the same for Sven. I think he's drawing on the same kind of like strong understanding of the game and AD carry experience.
Yeah. Same swap, just 6 years later. Okay. Team Liquid. On the bright side, there's only one more week in which they can go 1-1, because they've done it 5 weeks in a row. They started 3-0, and they've had 5 weeks in a row of 1-1s. Extremely disappointing compared to where their expectations are. And I have gradually dropped my expectations like week over week for what is happening to this team. And okay, I'm just going to double check who they play next week to see if they'll go 1-1 again. FlyQuest EG.
FlyQuest, yeah. Oof.
So would be a great time to 2-0 if they want to make a statement that they should be going to Worlds, but it's kind of crazy to me that they're actually in the position right now where it feels like they're the fourth best team, because C9 is starting to put things together. EG, 100 Thieves have had both long win streaks throughout the split, and TL is just starting. They had one good week where they played fairly weak competition and then have just been straight up 1-1 since then. Obviously the disappointing loss to C9 today, which was a very close game. It was the Baron sneak that changed it. They gave up a soul. They gave up an Elder. I'll flip this. What do you think the problems are for TL before I go into any positivity?
So I'll say I think the big thing, and I want to say we talked about this like before I was going, and I still need to go back and like watch specifically their mid game. I didn't have time to do it, unfortunately, last night. But I will do a VOD review, hopefully, or not hopefully, definitely before a broadcast this week. But the thing I'm most curious about is their mid game, because I actually think that their early games have been more proactive than people have generally given them credit for. And I think a lot of it is just like people equating if you run some of these early, quote unquote, early game compositions or like really strong lanes like a Draven, like a Kalista, some of the stuff that we've seen them favoring, not this week, but in the past.
But statistically, they have the best early game in the league still. It's plus 13, 51 gold at 15. The early game rating on Oracle's Elixir is 60.5, which isn't crazy high, but it is the highest in the league. So, best early game in the league.
Yeah, and Santorin has been really good about identifying where he wants to go early. Even if they do have a lane that gets targeted, like Bwipo, they're typically winning cross map or elsewhere on the map. And so I think they're actually early games generally, I can poke some holes in them, but overall have actually been, I think, stronger than people have given them credit for, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I do think happens is that in the mid game, and I really need to figure out like analytically through an eye test what I think is going wrong there. What I'm going to say that I, without looking again and doing like a
just
intense
like kind of what your
VOD
gut
review,
is.
my gut is that a lot of the plays that they're trying to set up, they're going for set plays that they know are correct to do, and they kind of take too long calculating what the risks are, and or if something does go wrong, they identify that they need to fix that rather than snowballing elsewhere because they have a lead elsewhere, right? So like I think last week against CLG, there was an interesting example with Santorin continuously going to mid lane for Bjergsen, where he maybe could have gone and continue to try to snowball the Draven, because on some of these, again, on some of these like early picks, you want to just keep like pub stomping that lane over and over again, right? Like my largest criticism of like a lot of the Kallistas we've seen, like even in the C9 game today, is that it's my opinion, and I've seen in other regions, that you can take over the entire bot side of the map in like an unpenetrable way almost, if you play around the Kalista in like a hyper aggressive way. And I'm not saying that's always correct for every team composition. It's not. But I have not seen it happen really here when teams have locked that in. And it's about being like hyper aggressive. And I'm using aggressive instead of proactive because they are different. Hyper aggressive with continuously diving the shit out of that, right? And having complete bot side jungle control on both red and blue, so your side and the opposing side, having absolute dragon control. Even in a game where this didn't happen, the C9 game, we saw that they had Drake stacking like automatically, right? You have that pushing lane. And you can absolutely just obliterate a game, and then it comes down to your mid game and continuing to snowball that advantage. And that's where I see Team Liquid falling short in some of these compositions that they're trying to run, where their mid game will go awry, where they'll be trying to set up around objectives and maybe one of them will get picked off, or they won't take it like quote unquote fast enough to kind of the timers defined by their composition. And then that gives the enemy team, especially if they do have stronger scaling or just easier to execute 5v5 team fighting, a much better chance of getting back into the game. So again, I don't necessarily want people to come away with like, Emily, diagnosis Team Liquid, this is exactly what's wrong. But like off of what I can remember from their games and not having done like a super in-depth VOD review yet, that's what's at the forefront of my mind, because it's a consistent pattern that I can recognize from, you know, the beginning to now, regardless of results.
And absolutely. I mean, you look even just at the trend line of their stats, best early game in the league, 8-5, doesn't necessarily seem like a super weak late game team. So clearly something is going wrong in the mid game. It has to be going wrong there. I will say part of the reason their early game is so dominant is like in their TSM game, they actually did pub stomp the bottom lane. Like that was just misfortune and dive after dive after dive and putting Instinct down like 80 CS. But with that being said, in their Cloud9 game today, like before there was the Baron that they gave up, there was the third dragon that they gave up in what to me was like a question mark ping fashion. Like I think Kalista had Rageblade and Cog didn't have his item spikes yet, but everyone else was equal in power. And like that's a fight where I think EG throws down. I think 100 Thieves probably throws down, and TL just kind of gave it. So there is still that slight level of passivity, and something I want to see more out of Whippo, actually, and this will go all the way back to finals of spring, is I just don't feel like he is like his assertive self within this team. He looked very not on the same page as TL. It was worst in finals against EG, but this like this mode, which can be good, where you're saying that he needs to be the glue for the team and that he needs to let the bot lane carry and that he needs to play tanks. But something that should have made this team so special from the start is the dynamic between him and Core JJ, where Core JJ is the one who understands macro in the Korean style, which would be slightly lower risk, and Bwipo, who adds the aggressive randomness. I just feel like he's not been able to get in sync with the rest of the team in any type of aggressive randomness, and that's a big dynamic that this team is missing. My deep dive that I need to do, you want to do the mid-game VOD review, I want to do like a draft deep dive. Because if I just like read comments, everyone is like, they haven't had a good draft all year. Like everyone's very negative on their drafting. I anecdotally know that it's changed a lot. Week to week, it seems like they're going with fairly different draft styles, but I would have to look back and try to see if objectively I actually thought they had losing drafts in the majority of games, which I'm just not sure of yet.
Yeah, and the point, just piggybacking off of that, one thing I do want to say is that today in their game, Bwipo did in his lane get like a really strong early lead, and additionally, Hans and Core, obviously they are going to get shoved in by the Costa Renato lane, and that lane did end up giving C9 bot side control. However, I thought they mitigated it pretty well, and like they were in a really strong position to enter the late game with this team fight comp with Lulu Cog just absolutely like artillery firing the entire time. So
I thought that was an Orianna angle instead of an Ahri.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah. It would have made them more passive, but I thought they were kind of going for a Juggernaut type thing. I'll read the draft out really quickly for people that are listening on podcast. It's like one minor draft point. So they had Cog, Lulu, Wukong, Olaf, and then they can 5-pick a mid laner. Talia's not available, Seraphine's not available, Zillion's not available. But like Orianna right there is slightly losing into Azir. So I thought maybe they were too worried about losing mid prio and then bot lane just getting really screwed, which would be why they pick Ahri for the mid prio. I think they could have gotten away with it, but I understand why they did the Ahri. I think it's more for lane than for team fights. But if they were able to get to the states that they did at 20 and 30 minutes and they had an Orianna instead of an Ahri, I think they just win. I think that just allows them to walk into so much space and take over. But that's just like a 5-pick small thing. Everything else has already transpired in the draft. Anything else you want to talk about?
In fairness, I thought this draft was just going to take over the game at some point when C9 did not. Yeah. When C9 did not get the lead that I would have wanted for like a Kalista Renata. Obviously, they have the Azir for insurance, and Jensen came on desk and he even said that he's like, "Oh, we weren't worried." Like Kalista doesn't think fall Jensen off is also just in terms of like
whatever he can to try and tilt TL. So he's just like, oh yeah, we had the better scaling.
He called them boring. It was pretty great.
Yeah.
He was like, yeah, I knew what we were getting into. They're not going to do anything. I was like, all right, Jensen, all right. I love Jensen so much. He's actually one of my favorite interviewers.
Yeah, it's like
interviews.
He like exists to say things that he knows are going to offend people. Like, you ever ask him about Bjergsen, he'll be like, yeah, I don't know. I think he's washed. He'll say something. He'll just say something like that. Or he'll do the like fake, I don't know. He has a great interview. He gets probably more hate than other mid laners for saying equivalent things, so he's kind of embraced it in the past, I think. Anything else you want to talk about before we wrap up?
No, I mean, I'm looking forward to doing this deep dive on TL, so maybe look forward to that.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll do something on broadcast about it, because I think, again, and this is compared to expectations, and I know you and I have talked about this multiple times here and on desk. It is because of the astronomical expectations that people have for this roster and that the roster and org has for itself, right? So
this is you don't have to do this if you don't want to, but I'm going to try and do it right now. This is like that waiting room segment where we tried to predict the 3 Worlds teams.
Ooh.
It's like understanding that we are at this point in time in week 6 and we are willing to change our opinions down the road. Like, what is it's not just top 3 in the regular season, it's who is going to actually progress through the Worlds. Mine, I'm going to say highest likelihood is EG. I believe we previously did this in like week 3 and I actually had 100 Thieves off the list. So at this moment in time, and it's going to be so boring, I realize I'm actually just reading the standings. It's EG, 100 Thieves, Cloud9, and then TL would be 4th. That's my 1, 2, 3, 4.
No, that also is my 1, 2, 3, 4,
So
and then I have CLG actually like definitively fifth above FlyQuest. I
okay.
think obviously we've talked about FlyQuest having the exact same schedule that CLG had last week, and they had their 2-0 then and looked really good, and then came into this week and faced tougher opponents and didn't look as good. But I love the way, and again, I like the way that CLG, and obviously, yes, it does bite them in the butt sometimes. So I do love the way that CLG are really willing to be proactive. Like in looking up just some random stats, because I wanted to see the goal difference at 15 that TL still have in their games, which is 13-11, which is
Yeah.
still significantly higher than C9, who are second. It's that I was looking at the kills, and it's that I'm pretty sure for kills at 15, CLG has 48.
Okay.
Which is C9 in second at 39.
Oh, CLG
and then
is
Fly.
just
Yeah, and
all
so
over
like
the place.
they also have 47 deaths, which is
50-50.
the second highest.
Yeah.
GG is first, but like again, I think I really appreciate how CLG have kind of embraced the way that they want to go for early skirmishes and how they can snowball the game from there. And I think that is going to continue to serve them well going forward when we're looking at them like as a potential playoff team. And I actually like a lot of the interesting things they're willing to put in drafts that also their players obviously feel like very, very comfortable on.
Also, a random tangent on the CLG thing. The Palafox thing they ran on broadcast this week, which it's like this quick 1-minute video that talks about what he does like in between scrims, but he has like basically one of those stairs that you can push around on wheels to go basically into the attic of the training facility. But he's like set up so much stuff up there, like a couch and a sleeping bag and a phone charger. And he's like this little hermit up there. And it's such a charming piece of content actually that reflects in a good light. But it got me thinking how hamstrung a team is by results. Because if you run that Palafox feature and he's 2-11, he just gets obliterated. But because he's had some good results lately, it's like super cute and endearing. I just think it's too bad because content like that is really great, but it's almost only runnable when a team is doing well, which is a tricky balance that a lot of these mid-tier teams have to deal with, I think.
Shout out to CLG for sending that content. Also, people might not know, but some of the team content stuff is submitted by like teams themselves.
Yes.
So more specifically, actually, I think FlyQuest team content has just been like
just
so good.
Their text flames. It's basically all they are. They just put up a green screen and have text, but it actually works pretty well.
Their Adult Swim promos, I think it's very cool.
Okay, so unfortunately, we literally 1, 2, 3, 4 to the worlds based off of the standings. We had no spicy takes of no, this team is actually underperforming.
I know I'm like the least hot take machine that we have in LCS, as proven today when I got pub stomped by both Freak and Mark, who had some like spicy takes.
Last year, the number 1 team at the end of the regular season missed Worlds.
Yep.
Fun fact. Probably not happening to EG, but anything can happen when playoffs happen. We still have 2 more weeks of regular season and then 4 weeks of playoffs, so this is definitely like a middle late of the split check-in, but I think always fun to do those sorts of things. Emily, thank you so much for joining once again.
That was fun.
Awesome. And thank you everybody else for watching, and see you next time.